Yes. Oh.
We're live. I think we're live.
Hello. Welcome to Happy Hour with Fernway. I am Randall Oliate, and today again we have Hannah Irish with us. Hannah, do you want to do a quick little intro?
Yeah. Hannah Irish. I am a PhD candidate at Pacific Graduate Institute studying mythological studies with an emphasis in depth psychology. And my dissertation is on re-mythologizing the gospel figure of Jesus as an embodied ecofeminist archetypal Christ figure within the context of the divine feminine. And yeah, here to talk more about the virginity myth that Randall and I talked about a couple weeks ago.
Heck yeah. Yeah. So this is Virginity Myth Part 2. If you missed Part 1, you can find it on our Facebook page under the live tab or on our YouTube channel, which is just Fernway Collective. And for anybody who missed us 2 weeks ago when we did the virginity myth, we tried to come up with a definition of virginity, right? Virginity is one of these things that we all think we know what it is, that we have this collective understanding. But once we really try to break it down and unpack it, we realize that the parameters aren't as clear as maybe we were led to believe when we were younger. And so what's our concept of virginity that we came up with? What does it mean? Because like we talked about a couple weeks ago, so often we think of losing one's virginity in a heteronormative context where it's penetrative vaginal sex. But of course, sex is more than just heteronormative, and it's more than just penile insertion.
Yes. Yeah, so I don't think we really came up with anything we were super excited about last week. We just came up with a lot of things that we were like, we want to get away from these ideas, right?
Mm-hmm.
So quick recap for those who have missed us, or even just a refresher. First of all, there is no medical basis for the idea of virginity. The idea that a woman's virginity can be judged on the status of her hymen is complete falsehood, and you should just let that go. Just like get rid of the idea of the hymen having anything to do with anyone's sexuality or, you know, anything. Like, just let it go. Just like let that one go. Flush it down the toilet.
Well,
Get
and
rid
that's
of
the
it.
thing. It can't have anything to do with it because men and gender nonconforming people can also have a first sexual experience. And maybe that's what we just want to call it, a first sexual experience. However, you as an individual choose to define that, whether it's sexual thoughts or nocturnal emissions or your first kiss or your first crush. Like there's so many different layers of what a sexual or sensual or partnered or multi-partner is the partner still the right word for multiple partners?
Partners.
Group experience. um, there's so many stops along the way, and everybody defines virginity differently. So if you have a definition of virginity, feel free to share it with us in the comments. And I feel like we've done a lot of defining what it's not, and In part one, we talked a little bit about, or we introduced the concept of purity culture and talked a little bit about how people in communities where purity culture is part of the culture. Oh my God, I'm sounding so redundant. In places where purity culture exists, a lot of people will find little loopholes and ways to get around not losing their virginity and therefore keeping their body sacred in some way, shape, or form. So in part one, we discussed that some people feel comfortable, or some women or female presenting members will feel comfortable having anal sex because it's not vaginal sex. And that means that they're still virgins, which I don't know about y'all. I know today's youth is like way more sexually open than our millennial generation ever was. But anal sex is like the last thing I would do. I don't know. That's like, I can't imagine like starting out the gate with that. Like that's not, that's a personal thing, I guess.
Yeah. Well, and I just think so with purity culture, and I believe that I introduced Joshua Harris a little bit last time.
Mm-hmm.
But he in the early 90s, mid 90s maybe. Oh no, I can't even remember what year the book was published. But anyway, at 21 years old, he was a pastor's kid, and he wrote the book I Kissed Dating Goodbye, which took this idea
1997.
Virginity. Thank you. Took this idea of virginity and sexual purity many, many steps further than it had been considered before. So prior to his book, the idea of purity and sexual purity was mostly physical. It was pretty much like, don't have sex outside of marriage. And, different groups, different family structures had, defined it differently, right? So for some people, it was very much like nothing below the belt, like nothing below the belt before marriage. That was their, but then there was everything in between. So in I Kissed Dating Goodbye, Joshua Harris wrote that Christian young people who, were pursuing romantic relationships shouldn't date in a conventional way. They should court instead. And that was a relationship where there was a lot more involvement from the community and the family. So he advocated for basically never spending any time alone with the person that you were courting. So everything that you did was there were people around, not necessarily that you were always in like a group setting, but like, maybe you're hanging out in the living room at one person's house and the parents are like in the kitchen or something. So like basically this idea that you're never going to find yourself alone enough to get into any trouble. But then also that, this idea that if you are courting someone, then you're courting them with the intention of marrying them. And so if you're courting someone with the intention of marrying them, then at the same time that you're doing that, you're also building up the community that's going to support you as a newlywed couple. So that's, it was really important that like the parents of both young people were encouraging and supportive of the relationship. It was important that the church community, this kind of assumes that these two young people are at the same church, but that the church community is supportive and encouraging, and the adults are there to be mentors and guides, and that if you got to a point in this courting relationship where you realized you weren't going to marry that person, that you needed to end it right away. Mm-hmm. And he also maintained that you really shouldn't even kiss until you're married, or at least until you're engaged, until it's very, very serious. Very minimal physical affection. And he also, I don't know if he's the first who introduced it, but he certainly made it go viral for the time, the idea of emotional purity. And so his thinking was that basically every time you were in a relationship with someone, you gave a piece of yourself, right, a piece of your heart to that person, and you could never get it back. And so the more people that you were in a relationship with, the more pieces of your heart you gave away. And so eventually, like, you were going to have less to give your spouse. And
But what about like for yourself? Like, is his idea that you could give all of these pieces of yourself away, and then like you're like the giving tree, you're just a stump, you're an empty shell?
Yeah, I
Maybe
don't
that's
think
rhetorical.
the whole yeah, there was no self-care considered. Nothing about that. And so with it, again, within that, this whole emotional purity thing, he also brought up, you know, issues of like lust and temptation, and kind of was also one of the early starters of modesty culture. The idea that women are responsible for men's thoughts based on how women choose to dress. And if women dress in a way that creates a thought in a man, then that woman is basically responsible for how that man behaves based on that thought as well. So,
but there's biblical precedent for these ideas, right? Like, I mean, he's just kind of modernizing them, because I know we spoke about how there's a similar line in the Quran that is the same kind of spirit, right? That women need to dress modestly in order to avoid harassment on the street.
So, to my knowledge, there is nothing in Jewish scriptures or the Christian scriptures, nothing in the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, as it's more commonly referred to, that suggests a woman's choice of dress makes her responsible for how men treat her. There are stories, of course, of prostitutes in the Bible, but those stories don't have anything to do with how the woman is dressed. The thing that comes to mind the most for me is in the Gospels, and forgive me because I don't know where, I don't have a reference for you, but I mean, I think people are familiar with this story. But the disciples asked Jesus, basically, like, what do I do if my hand causes me to sin? And Jesus says, well, cut it off. And they ask, well, you know, what if my eye causes me to sin? And he says, well, pluck it out. And the
pluck it out. I misheard you. I was like, oh, is Jesus saying F it up right now? I'm here for that.
Pluck it out. So clear, and they are talking about like women's dress specifically when they ask about the eyes, and Jesus's response is just like, if part of your body is causing you problems, that's a personal problem. Like, that is on you. That is not on anybody else. It is your body. And that's the only thing that I know of where the appearance of a woman is in any way linked to a man's behavior. And Jesus is like, no, you can't blame her for that. That's on you.
Good on Jesus for saying that. I'm going to pull a couple citations. We've got a passage in 1 Timothy, which admittedly is not a book that I'm familiar with at all.
I bet I know which one I bet I know what's coming.
1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 9 to 10. Likewise also that women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel, with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly attire, but what is proper for women who profess godliness with good works. So a lot of that seems like it's related to vanity, not necessarily sexuality or treatment. There's another passage from
It
First
had to
Corinthians,
do,
a lot about, oh, sorry.
well, yeah. So most, or at least most that I'm familiar with, scholars look at that passage in Timothy, and it's more about humility. So at that time, a lot of churches were house churches. So wealthier members of the community would open up their homes for believers to come and have church. And so because they were hosted by these wealthier members of the community, there was a lot of like, that's great, but don't flaunt your wealth. Like, that's not what this is about. You're not inviting us into your home to show off how wealthy you are. That's not what this is about. So it wasn't even so much about vanity as it.
Do a lot of churches know that, or churchgoers know that church isn't the place to go and like show off your fanciness? Because I feel like I was taught the complete opposite growing up.
Right, like your
right?
Sunday
When you
best.
go to church, you show up in your Sunday best and you make sure you present the best, fanciest, fake version of yourself, right? Like you wear this mask that's acceptable on Sundays. That's a whole other conversation. So that's really interesting. There are several passages about women's hair being their crowning glory and to cover it or to cut it short if you refuse to cover it, which again feels like it's speaking to pride and vanity and like material,
it was very much
kind
cultural.
of cultural.
It had to do with the culture. I mean, because it's the women's hair can be thought of similarly to like men's facial hair. And there were cultural laws, like there were temple laws about that kind of thing. And so remember too that like these early Christians, we call them Christians, we look back and we call them early Christians, but they weren't. They were primarily Jews who were following the teachings of this Jewish rabbi Jesus. And then as that grew, and the Gentiles, which simply means the non-Jews, as they started to join the ranks of this new movement, that's when you see things start to change, because there's so much in Paul's letters in the Christian scriptures where the Jews are trying to figure out like, well, what do we make the Gentiles do? And a lot of it comes down to like, well, like the Jewish laws regarding all of these different things, we're not going to force them on the Gentiles. And so eventually then they just kind of start to go away. So people who are new into this movement, it's just no longer, these things are no longer required. And so you see different cultural norms start to come into play. So some of this too, depending on, and just for clarification, each of these letters, the epistles, were written to a very specific group of people under very specific circumstances. And so they're not meant to be generalizations. They're not meant to be universalized. They were Paul or Peter or whoever responding to challenges that a specific church group was facing. And so in some of them, you have a cultural clash, right, between the Jesus following Jews and the Gentiles who are joining this movement, and the Roman culture that is there. And so sometimes you have these things where we don't necessarily have the context when we just read it from the Bible to say like, oh, he's saying don't do this, but do this, because the idea is to distinguish yourself from like the Roman temple priests and priestesses. So there's a lot of that going on as well.
Okay. So basically we have a religion being born out of multiple cultures in transition, kind of coming together to form something new, but different bits and pieces of the Christian Bible and of course the Hebrew Bible that Christians refer to as the Old Testament, being written by different people for different people, and then kind of all coming into one cohesive text that now has been translated infinite number of times by different people who have different agendas. And political goals, and all sorts of things. So we just have this feels just like a big alphabet soup or something with a lot of stuff floating around, and you really have to dig really hard to find the context. Okay, so this was a really long-winded way of saying that
there's not actually a lot of biblical foundation for modesty culture. Taking us back.
And that is so interesting. I read a funny thing to say. Am I allowed to criticize the church because I grew up in it? I'm going to say I was baptized Catholic, so I'm just going to speak on my experience. But I saw a really great tweet the other day that said, according to the laws set forth in the Christian Bible, you're not allowed to wear mixed fabrics, right? And so your cotton poly blend socks are they say more about that in the Bible, that's a sin, than homosexuality. So or purity, right? And so once the church starts really complaining about socks and mixed fabrics, then we'll start listening to the religious foundation for other complaints that around.
Yeah. Well, and that's such a perfect example of how we need cultural context. Right? Because those laws, especially in the Jewish scriptures, right? Especially those ones, they were so contextual. They were a response to things that were happening, and we don't necessarily have record of exactly what was going on. We have the response to it. So same with the epistles in the Christian scriptures. We don't have the letters that Paul was receiving from these churches. We don't have record of the message of what the messengers were telling him necessarily, except for when occasionally he'll write, "I have received word that blah 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 blah," and you're like, okay, well, I'm sure that the people he wrote the letter to know exactly what he's talking about, but that's super vague for us 2,000 years later. So it just, context is everything. It's just everything.
If only the people who wrote all this stuff down were anthropologists. That would make all of this so much easier. Really good record keepers.
Right. But also when all of this was, so at least with the Christian scriptures, right? The Gospels, the epistles, even the book of Revelation, these things were not written under the expectation that anyone would be looking at them thousands or even hundreds of years later. This was a much more, the epistles weren't written to be kept as records at all. They were addressing specific people in a specific situation. And even the Gospels were eventually written down after decades of oral tradition, when the early Christians realized that things weren't going the way they thought they were going to. And so they needed to preserve this information for future generations. And so, but even in their mind, even in writing down the Gospels for future generations, their context was not 2,000 years worth of future generations. Their context was a few generations. Let's write this down so that our great grandkids can have it. There was no intention of us sitting here today trying to make sense of this. And the same is true of the Jewish scriptures. The books of history, for example, they were written down as history, but they were written down as history in a specific context. And it was when the Jews were in exile in Babylon, and they needed to remember their history in order to keep their cultural heritage and their ethnic heritage. They had to write it down because they had been forcibly removed from their homeland. So even the purpose of their history is different than what we think of as history now.
Right, right. And a lot of what I know about the Jewish diaspora is that that's when the culture went from oral tradition to written tradition. And it was specifically to make sure they all had like the same thing written down as they were being dispersed, forcibly dispersed from their homeland. And that's when things kind of got static, because when we're talking about culture and cultural norms, as we see language and norms and attitudes shift, even subtly, like, and even like what we were talking about last week with our Pride panel on the language that we use. And when I was sitting with Goldman and he used the word Negro to describe himself, that is a word that has changed in meaning, and the word queer, right? Queer used to be a derogatory slur. And just in the span of less than 100 years, it's changed meanings several times. And we're looking at documents that are 2,000 plus years old that have also been translated and changed and were written by a different culture for themselves, not for who we are going to be. And so for us to even be having these conversations about, I mean, it's really wild to think about.
Yeah. Yeah. So
what up with purity culture? Yeah.
Yeah. So back to Joshua Harris. So modesty culture, right? Women's appearance responsible for men's thoughts and therefore their actions, which we know is problematic. That is rape culture at its finest, and victim blaming all the way around.
And this is what we're seeing in school dress codes, right? That
don't get me started.
Has been started.
Yeah, I went to.
I went to a public high school in Los Angeles, and I still got in trouble for showing my belly, or if my bra straps were showing, or I mean, because back in the day, I used to dress differently than I do now, like a Victorian ghost. I wore like little crop tops and long hippie skirts, and I remember the biggest thing I got in trouble for was that I wore a Hooters waitress tank top. And it met all of the dress code requirements. The straps were thick enough. My shirt met my pants. My belly wasn't showing. And the principal came up to me at lunch and was like, "You need to put on a sweatshirt." And I was like, "It's 85 degrees. I'm not going to do that." I'm not in violation of dress code. And he's like, "Yeah, your tank top is offensive to me." And I said, "Well, your tie is offensive to me. Do you need to take it off or cover it up?" And he's like, "Go to the dean." Right. And I was like, "It says a family restaurant on here." And when I told the dean what had happened, she was a woman. She literally just started laughing. And she's like, "This is ridiculous. Like, I guess we'll have to have you call your mom." So I called my mom, and she was like having lunch with a friend, and they just started losing it that I was getting in trouble for this. And I was like 2 months away from graduating. But that was always the thing. Geez. Like, if a girl is considered a distraction for her teachers or for her classmates, then she's the one that gets pulled from learning and needs to change. And so, and I feel like this obviously was part of our like American culture much longer than 1997 when Harris wrote this book.
Oh yeah.
But maybe he gave a little bit more of a name and a language to something that had already started happening in our culture.
Well, and I think part of it too, he was 21. So he was speaking to his demographic was the idea. And so he became the poster boy for all of this, because it was like, oh, well, here's this 21-year-old saying this is how Christian young people should behave. Like, yeah, like, let's do it. His parents were also very well known in the Christian homeschooling world. And so they did a lot of speaking engagements. They went on tour for different things. And when Harris was a young-ish teenager, 14 or 15, maybe 15, his dad actually had him start joining him on stage sometimes to talk about different things from, his perspective as a teenager. So yeah, so this all happens. I read I Kissed Dating Goodbye in high school. A lot of people that I know did, a lot of people I grew up with did. There were a few other books that also were along those lines. One of them was called True Love Waits, and there was a sequel to that one. Harris also wrote a sequel to I Kissed Dating Goodbye. I don't remember the name of it though. So this was really prevalent in the aughts. Purity culture was huge, and I have heard that it was still pretty big in the teens, although I was removed from it at that point. So I wasn't as in touch with, what was happening as far as the youth went at that point. But what's been really interesting, and I say interesting because I don't have a better word because it's awful, but it's interesting, right? Is that in the last probably decade or so, psychologists and counselors are starting to look at the consequences for adults, right? Millennials, especially, who were raised in this culture and what that has meant for them coming into adulthood and trying to have relationships and trying to figure out what sexual intimacy is and how to have healthy relationships. And there are, I have it because I don't want to get this wrong because it's too important for me to get this wrong. So I'm going to find this.
Well, but that's a great question, right? How do you have a healthy adult sexual relationship if you're doing something that you've been told your whole life is wrong and bad and sinful? How do you switch gears like that in your head and see your partner as somebody who's valuable instead of somebody that you're defiling or somebody who's defiling you, or all of that psychological?
Yeah. So it is a huge thing. We don't just have a switch in our brains that says, oh, now I'm married, now this is okay. Like, we might tell ourselves that, people might be telling us that. However, that's not the way that's just not the way we work, right? Like, if we've been believing for years that something is, that something is wrong, then it takes time to realize that, like, now you're in a context where it's okay. But okay, so okay, so short little thing that I'll just read. Of course, there's nothing wrong with a woman or a man choosing to save sexual intimacy for marriage. However, for those raised in purity culture, they often feel damned if they do, damned if they don't, due to the pressure from the community, both before and after the wedding. For many individuals who succeed at saving sex for marriage, their sexual relationship with their spouse is not the happily ever after they were promised, due to the work of overcoming years of sexual repression and shame. And some individuals' struggles are so intense that they mirror symptoms of childhood sexual abuse. And that is obviously a very strong statement, but it comes from an article written by a psychologist, Tina Shermer Sellers. The article is called How the Purity Movement Causes Symptoms of Sexual Abuse. And it can just be so intense. for some people in some communities and some churches and some families, the shame associated with sexuality in general, anything, right? Like, we're talking French kissing, we're talking masturbation, anything that brings up any of those feelings. Like, I know people who were told feeling horny was sinful, right? You're talking about adolescents, like, they don't have control over their bodies, they don't have control over what their hormones are doing, like, right? Like, so if you are being told from even pre-adolescence, right? And think about how much younger boys and girls are maturing now. Like, I got my period when I was 11.
Same.
Which was pretty young in my friend group. Like, I got my first period, my first bra, when I was 11. I had friends in high school who didn't get their first period until they were like 15 or 16 years old. And so you have these pre-adolescent kids, they're children, and they're being told that something that they cannot control, something that they don't understand, is sinful and shameful, and they need to do everything in their power to avoid it. And then that narrative is reinforced for maybe a decade as they go through high school, right? And they are coming into young adulthood.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I can just say from my personal experience, reckoning with that as an adult and trying to figure out physical intimacy, sexual intimacy, even just romantic intimacy, right? Like, even just that emotional, psychological connection with someone was very, very challenging.
Well, and it seems like it would be easy for somebody who grew up in that culture, in that environment, to conflate sexual feelings or lust or horniness with love, right? If you can't, if you're not allowed to feel those feelings for somebody you aren't married to, then that becomes synonymous with love. And I mean, I'm just spitballing here, but I can only imagine that leads to, right, a lot of, like, not just problematic relationships, but abusive relationships as well, like emotionally, psychologically abusive, because these people don't necessarily know how to look at each other as sexual beings and have it be okay. The Madonna horror complex. And I know we touched a little bit on that in part one.
Well, and on the extreme end of that, the idea that sex is only for marriage, again, can easily become that sex is your duty in marriage. And that can lead to spousal sexual abuse and spousal rape, because there is an idea
up until
that
recently,
you owe that to your spouse.
Right. And up until recently, spousal rape wasn't even considered a crime. And let me clarify, raping your wife wasn't considered a crime, right? Or beating your wife. And there are biblical passages to support the submission of wives to their husbands.
Yes, but there are not biblical passages to support men treating their wives poorly.
Well, but if a man is supposed to be the head of the house and the woman is supposed to submit to their rule and their desires, and that's what makes a good Christian woman, then how, I mean, that just leaves a lot of room for interpretation.
But that passage even that you're paraphrasing the first half of it, which is what people love to talk about, which is, wives, submit to your husbands as you submit to Jesus or to Christ, or whatever it is. Husbands, love your wives. It's a two-way thing. They're not separate. It's not one or the other. You don't get to pick and choose. And
but I'm going to say, some people think that love is tough love. Some people think that love is tough love, and
but even that verse, I wish I knew the reference. Wives, submit to your husbands as to Christ. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loves the church. And I can't think of a single example of Jesus loving in a violent manner. And if you bring up the temple, let me just tell you, property damage, I don't give a shit.
What? Property damage isn't the same thing as people's lives or people's humanity? That's a hot take, Hannah.
So the one instance of Jesus being anything but compassionate and merciful and generous was one instance of property damage, and it had to do with defiling a sacred space. Very different, right? So husbands, love your wives as Christ loves the church. That is a selfless,
okay, but if Jesus is mad
love.
About people defiling a sacred space, I'm going to say that if you are of the mind that a woman's body is a sacred space and it has been defiled by somebody who is not her husband, then that opens the door to all sorts of things.
Well, and then we go back to what we talked about last time with, the laws in the Jewish scriptures about stoning a woman who is found not to be a virgin on her wedding day. Or even in the Gospels, the woman caught in adultery. But in that moment, Jesus steps in, right? Like, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. She is dragged out into the square, and people are surrounding her, and they are calling for her to be stoned. And Jesus walks up, and
does he say, "Let he without sin cast the first stone"?
That is what he says. And you know what happened after that? Everybody walked away. Everybody was like, "Oh, yep, nope, that's not me. I'm not perfect."
It's like a story that should be revisited,
right?
Every few weeks,
all the time.
in this country, every day, maybe. Yeah. So we had a comment from Anne that says, "Wow, how messed up are those adolescents that are told to be abstinent?" So I think that's a really big part of this conversation. Thank you, Anne, about abstinence only sex ed and where that comes from. And obviously that
comes from purity
overlap
culture.
With purity culture. Right?
Yep. Yeah.
Because when I went to Christian middle school, at all our dances, we had to leave room for Jesus when we're slow dancing.
Yeah, so the abstinence only sex education movement is 100% advocated for by evangelicalism. And I'm going to use that term broadly. We don't have time to get into what that means.
Well, that's what I learned in sex ed, and I went to a Lutheran middle school. So I think it's a pretty broad Christian piece of American Christianity, like teaching abstinence only culture. And how does that work?
We know it's not effective. Like, we know that is not effective. And so instead of having adolescents, teenagers, kids, young adults, whatever, not having sex, they're having unsafe sex because
having
they
secret sex.
Have not been taught differently. Yeah, it's secretive. So you have kids, with this abstinence only education, kids aren't being taught consent. They're not taught that they have autonomy and bodily agency, so as long as they're not doing this thing, then they're fine. But then when they decide that they want to do this thing, they have no idea how to do that in a sexually healthy, a physically healthy, emotionally healthy, psychologically healthy way. They have no idea because no one is teaching them that.
And I think this brings up other issues too, like in our culture where we define adulthood and autonomy and like the age of consent is wildly different from biological adulthood and biological markers of adulthood. And so there's just a lot of muddy water there, right? Where we have kids like us who started our periods at 11 years old. That means that we were able to have a child and reproduce, but we're in a society where we're obviously still children. still behaving as children, still have all the rights and responsibilities of being a child. And there's such a huge range in sexual maturity and biological markers of adulthood that it's you. I knew a girl when I was younger that she went through puberty when we were in 3rd grade and had to wear a bra, got her period, and for all intents and purposes looked like a more mature woman than her actual biological age. And so, and here I'm getting into my like nerdy anthropology territory, but anthropologically speaking, so many cultures define adulthood by those physical markers. And then once you are physically an adult, you go through some sort of ritual process and come out the other side as a full adult with all of the rights and responsibilities of an adult in that culture bestowed upon you. And now we have such extended adolescence that somebody can appear to be an adult. I mean, look at movies like Step Brothers. I'm not going to go on a whole tangent about Step Brothers because obviously I love Will Ferrell and it's a whole thing, but that's the culture that we're in, right? Where 40-year-old men are acting like adolescents. And we have this extended period of adolescence that we don't know, when does adulthood start? It's gotten muddy. And even though we have symbolic adulthood ceremonies like bar mitzvahs or quinceañeras or Sweet 16 or a debutante ball, we are not actually presenting these people to society as a full adult. They're relics from the past when you would have been considered adult. But think about that. In Jewish culture, a 13-year-old boy would be considered an adult after going through having the mitzvah. And can you imagine us treating a 13-year-old like an adult in today's society? Yeah, it just doesn't happen.
Well,
and so that blurs the lines a lot too, because now we have people who are biologically adult members of our species, but psychologically and emotionally still children and naive. And there's a huge disconnect with that. Then you have people like Courtney Stodden at 15 years old marrying, or well, I guess when they got married, she was 16, marrying a 50-some-year-old man, and she looks like an adult, but is still only 15. And now we're getting into issues of grooming and parental consent for marriages. And there are still, most states in the US, you can get married with parental consent, even if you are under the age of consent in your state. You could be 11, 12 years old, and your parents could say, yep, I sign off on my 11-year-old to marry this 55-year-old creeper. And that's perfectly legal, right? And that makes us cringe because we know just because you start your period and you got to wear a bra doesn't mean you're an adult. And that's true in our society. And so this is very, very complicated. So I guess what I'm trying to say is we have people who are still being treated like children in our culture who have all of the biological and sexual urges of wanting to reproduce from an anthropological standpoint. Just on a base physical biological level. And now we're teaching them that is wrong and sinful to get a boner or to feel tingling in your nether regions. Something's wrong with you. When that's the biological reality for most of humanity, right? I mean, we're talking about Darwin here, not just survival of the fittest, but like, what do we want to do? We want to reproduce and we want to make sure that we're immortal. And how are we immortal? By having kids. One way. And not symbolic immortality. And it's just fucking confusing because you've got 16-year-olds that look like 35-year-olds in development, women. And you've got 16-year-olds who look closer to 10-year-olds in biological development. And then emotionally and psychologically, they're all over the place too. So like, how do you tell? Now we've got these arbitrary markers of age and age of consent. Like, okay, well, if you're 16, then you can consent to having sex with somebody who's over 18, but only if they're like up to 18 or 19, right? Like there's in some states,
right,
like
there's
it's
like that
2 or 3
year
years older.
Yeah.
So you can have sex with an
Well,
18 or 19-year-old, but not like a 45-year-old, which like is good.
Right. Well, but then you get into that same thing like we were talking about before with the whole idea of like saving sex or saving intimacy for marriage, and the idea that like this switch flips like on your wedding night, right? So like there's literally there's no difference between someone who is 15 and going to turn 16 the next day and then them on their 16th birthday. It's nothing but a number. Again, like there's nothing magical happens that makes them all of a sudden emotionally mature enough to consent or educated enough to consent or like any of that, right? Like
I'm sorry, I'm laughing.
So
I just can't.
arbitrary.
I'm just thinking about the Sound of Music now. You are 16, going on 17, delicate as a rose. Like, come on, that song is creepy and rapey, and it's a Nazi singing it. Sorry, we can't get through one conversation without me bringing up a musical. It's so applicable, right? We've got these young girls, and I mean, let's talk about porn, yo. Is watching porn okay? Is watching porn somehow preserving your virginity? Unclear. I don't think there's a clear answer to that, but there's a whole subset of porn of like taking the virginity, right? Of young girls who are virgins or who are naive, or barely legal, right? I mean, okay, not about porn, but I'll admit, like when I was in high school, I hung out with older people all the time and they all called me jailbait. And I thought it was like a fun, cute nickname because I was young. And like looking back, it's creepy. It's really creepy.
Yeah.
And people were like waiting for me to turn 18. I just moved and I found a shirt buried in a tub that says, "Kiss me, I'm legal." And I don't remember wearing it, but it must have been from my 18th birthday.
Oh, jeez.
Like so cringy. Because we grow up in this culture and we think that somehow like, well, okay, we turn 18, like now it's on. Now it's a free for all. Now people don't have to feel bad about looking at me or like talking to me, and there's not this like weird cloud hanging over my head.
Yeah.
It's so gross. Like I literally just found that shirt like 2 days ago and it was turned my stomach. Okay, so let's talk about your experience with purity culture, because I know like some celebrities were really a big part of this conversation of bringing purity culture kind of into the national spotlight. Like Britney Spears was famously a virgin. And there's like that whole interview with Justin Timberlake, like, oh, ha, 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 you know, she wasn't a virgin after we dated. But such like a bride price, something like that, placed on the heads of these female celebrities. But then you also have male celebrities like the Jonas Brothers, who are famous for wearing their purity rings and for participating in that purity culture. And South Park does a great episode about this, obviously. But when you grew up in the evangelical tradition, did you wear a purity ring? Was there some sort of ritual or ceremonial aspect of that? Did you just buy one and wear it? Like, how does that work?
So I was given a promise ring, and the promise was to save myself for marriage. And that was something.
Who'd you promise it to?
My parents and to God. That's who I made the promise to.
Okay. And anybody interested in the South Park, it's season 13, episode 1, and it's called The Ring. So I'm sorry, Hannah, continue. Okay, so you made a promise to God and your parents, the church, yourself, that you're going to remain chaste until marriage?
I mean, I was 11 when this happened, so I didn't know what I was saying. Right? So, yeah.
So like indoctrination?
I had no
Interesting.
idea. I had no idea what I was really doing. Um, and then
Hmm.
my sophomore year of high school, so 15 to 16, I went and participated in a purity class through my church, which was only for the girls. There was nothing corresponding for the boys. And we learned a lot of things. And some of them I recognized as problematic then, but I didn't have language for it. I didn't know what to say about it. I just knew it didn't feel okay. And
Mm-hmm.
looking back on it, I can definitely see it's hard not to call it spiritual abuse. It's hard to call it spiritual abuse because of the people involved, but the spiritual abuse is just basically when religion is used to manipulate or coerce someone. And so,
Isn't that what
oh, Randall, don't even get me started. You know that's not what religion is. Um, so
but like
there were,
okay, tabling that
that's a
for
whole
now.
nother night. We have like 2 minutes. So um, yeah, so there were parts of this purity class that were absolutely meant to be emotionally and psychologically manipulative. And when you are using religion, when you are using God to do that, it is spiritual abuse.
Got it.
And
Because a lot of
so
people
I
would just call that
experienced,
like instilling good morals and values into you. And I think
mm-hmm,
that's where like my
yeah,
discomfort came from,
mm,
because isn't that what religion is about? Is about having a set of morals and values to guide people and to kind of connect, like provide cohesion to the community, to having a shared set of values, a shared value system.
yes. And that is different than manipulation or coercion.
Okay, that's fair.
And because this was traumatic for me, that's where I'm going to leave it.
Okay.
Um, but this class did culminate in a purity ball, where all of the girls got basically like prom dresses, and all of them were supposed to, their both parents were invited, but there was a little ceremony, where the dad would walk his daughter up to the front, and there was some little exchange where, he pledged to watch over his daughter and help her stay sexually pure for her husband, and she pledged to, remain pure for her husband or whatever. This was many years ago. I don't remember all the details, um, but purity balls were a huge thing. I don't know if they happen that much anymore, but they were huge for a long time. And in some instances, that was when a girl might receive a promise ring or a purity ring. It might have been part of the purity ball thing. In my experience, it wasn't. They were separate. But I mean, yeah, there so many things that I look back on to, especially that purity class, and how much I have had to overcome to be healthy when it comes to relationships, because the expectations that I was led to have were not realistic. And the reasons that I was, persuaded to view things a certain way were manipulative, and they were done in such a way that I wasn't thinking for myself at all. I didn't understand a lot of what was being asked of me or what was being instilled in me until years later. Some point about a year or two after I finished undergrad was really when a lot of this started. When I started really looking back on things, that's when I stopped wearing my promise ring, because I realized how problematic that whole culture was. So, and that's why, like, that article that I referenced, where some people experience symptoms as intense as childhood sexual abuse, like, I have no problem believing that, because I know what it was like for me. And so to imagine that it could be worse is not hard at all.
And you just need to look at the way Carrie's mom treated her in the Stephen King novel, Carrie.
I don't know that one.
Well, she called Carrie's boobs dirty pillows, famously. And it was all about body shaming and sexuality shaming and that purity culture in the 70s. And and that comes up for me because that I don't think anybody could read that book or watch that movie and say that isn't abuse. And that feels like the type of spiritual abuse that you're talking about, that shaming, shaming a person for their body existing as it exists naturally and biologically.
Yeah. A lot of guilt, a lot of shame.
Yeah, not ideal for anybody. So what are our takeaways from this conversation? This really heavy, wonderful conversation. We've got that there's not really scriptural precedent for modesty culture and purity culture in the Christian Bible. We
not how we understand it today. No.
Sure, not how we understand it today. We talked about the blurred line between our modern day culture, what we consider an adult in an emotional or psychological way, and what we consider an adult in a biological way, and how there's a disconnect between those. And I think the biggest takeaway, though, is that virginity doesn't matter. Purity doesn't matter. And I guess those are kind of big statements, but if you feel like you have yet to have a sexual experience, and in part one, we talked about how maybe we should consider our first orgasm as losing our virginity instead of our first sexual experience. And so maybe, like, if you think you haven't had a fulfilling sexual experience yet, like, that's okay to consider yourself a virgin until maybe you meet somebody that you have a more intimate connection with that's not just physical. Or you could consider losing your virginity the first time you get a crush on somebody, or the first time you start to feel lust. And I hate using the word lust because there's such negative connotations with that within Christianity. Horniness? I don't know how you want to say
sexual attraction.
Yeah, sexual awakening. Ooh, we've talked about that before. If you're looking for a good sexual awakening, I really recommend watching the Rocky Horror Picture Show, if that's on your that's on your list for today. But yeah, I mean, you get to decide who you are and what your worth is and what your value is. And it's not tied to if you've let somebody touch your boobs or touch your crotch, right? They can't take anything away from you. That does not make you less of a person. That doesn't make you more of a person either, right?
Right.
And I don't know, just fuck everybody, right? Decide for yourself. Decide how you feel for yourself. And don't let people guilt or shame you into thinking you are less than because of thoughts you've had or urges you've had or sexual attraction that you might have that goes against the convention that you were raised in.
If you haven't had any of those things either.
Yeah.
Right? Because there's the opposite stigma as well. And you shouldn't feel shame or guilt if you don't experience those kinds of things either, or if you haven't yet.
Yeah. If sex doesn't sound appealing or doesn't sound fun for you, cool. If sex sounds like the most fun thing ever, also cool. Do it safely.
Yes, please.
And as always, like if anybody has any questions or thoughts, pop it in the comment or shoot us a private message. If it might be something that is a little more sensitive in nature, you're not comfortable speaking about publicly. Here at Fernway Collective, we have a great team of all sorts of different types of people that represent different pieces of the sexuality spectrum, represent different pieces of the gender spectrum. And we're always happy to engage in conversation. And before we sign off, I just want to let everybody know that we have decided that next month's happy hours are going to be themed around a great book that we all love that we've talked about in happy hours before, called Cassandra Speaks. It's available on our website at fernwaycollective.org, and we will be releasing a schedule with happy hour topics themed around pieces of Cassandra Speaks, so you can read a little bit and watch along with us and participate in the conversation, or you can just tune in without reading, no pressure. And I'm very much looking forward to that. So our next conversation is going to be on Cassandra Speaks, and it's going to be centered on Eve as the badass female figure that she really is. So thank you everybody for tuning in. We really appreciate y'all joining us for these conversations. And of course, if you're watching this after the live air, also feel free to drop a comment or ask questions, and we will get to those. So thank you so much, Hannah, for being here with us
You're
today.
welcome. Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it. Even with the, what is it, 100 and some degrees up in the Pacific Northwest right now.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Most places don't have air conditioning. It's rough. I'm melting. I'm very melty right now.
You're the Wicked Witch of the West. Just kidding. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody.